One of the uh, one of the great perks of my job is that I've gotten to know the great Harry Middleton, and many of you don't. You've worked at this institution for a couple of years. You know of Harry, but you may not have been exposed to Harry. And he knows the story of Lyndon Baines Johnson as well as anyone. The other day, there were about half a dozen folks from the CIA who were here, and several of us attended a talk that Harry did with these folks. And it was just phenomenal. And it occurred to me that if we're talking to a bunch of folks from the CIA, Harry should be talking to our staff about Lyndon Johnson as well. And you should hear from Harry himself about his experiences with President and Mrs. Johnson. Harry came to work for President Johnson in 1967 and stayed with him throughout the balance of his tenure, after which he returned to Austin with the Johnsons and worked with President Johnson on his memoir, along with Bob Hardesty and others. And it was about a year or so into Harry's tenure after the White House that President Johnson asked him to be, much to Harry's surprise, to be the director of the LBJ Library, a post that Harry held for 30-some years. So if there's anyone who knows about the LBJ Library, it's Harry. So I wanted you to hear from Harry directly, and I'm sure he'd be happy to take questions afterwards. So without further ado, Mr. Director.
Mr. Director, thank you. This is very much like old times, but looking around, I realize it's a lot like new times, too. I'd like to start by asking you something. I retired as director of the library in January 2002. How many of you came to work for this institution after that time? Good God.
And that's why we're doing this today.
Good Lord. When Mark asked me to do this, I was really quite honored and flattered. I thought it was fine, but then thinking that of the staff that I knew and how stable it was, I thought anything I could say is going to be old hat. But then I realized that even with the staff that existed when I was here, I didn't have occasion to talk about President Johnson much. He was a shared commodity. We all worked. It was somebody we all worked with, and talking about him was really not really part of the daily operation. So I'm pleased to be able to do that now. What my charge, meeting with the CIA analysts, was to do what I could. This is what they asked me to do, to help them better know and understand Lyndon Johnson, the man, as well as the president. And of course, the question that first arises is, what are my qualifications to talk about him? Did I know him? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. I knew him because I wrote for him, and I wrote successfully for him. So that implies a certain amount of knowledge. I did tap into the way he thought. I believe I did, and I believed in what he was doing in the White House, and I think that there was a simpatico feeling between him and me, which at times was tested, but for the most part, it did endure. And when he asked me to be director of this library, I became quite aware that along with that, was a charge from him to me to do what I could through the papers and the documents that were under my control for so long, to see to it that his story was told in its totality. When he told me once that he wanted everything in this library open as quickly as possible, it made an impression on me. And I think as a result of that, I think the library began to achieve a reputation that has been, I think, quite well known and regarded among historians and other users of this institution's holdings. When he told me that he wanted no effort made to protect him, the instructions that he gave me on that occasion were so clear that they are still emblazoned on my brain. He said, "Good men have been trying to protect my reputation for 40 years, and not a damn one has succeeded. Now, what makes you think you can?" So, so that was the charge that that animated the spirit of this library from the beginning. I'd like to claim some part of that spirit, and to the degree that that Tina and Regina and Claudia and others who are around have some claim to it. I will stake my claim too, but it's LBJ's spirit that animated this library from the beginning. What he wanted out of it, what he wanted it to be, what he wanted it to do. So yeah, I think I knew him, not to that extent, but on the other hand, the answer is no. I don't think anybody ever knew Lyndon Johnson totally. Maybe Lady Bird, but even she at times confessed that she was confused by him. I have said before, and it's not, I suppose, a particularly good thing for someone associated with an historical institution to say, but I don't think any historian has yet got him, and I don't think an historian is the one that will finally nail Lyndon Johnson down. Somewhere out there in the great future, there's a dramatist who is going to come as close to capturing him as has ever been done. When he became president, a political writer named T.H. White, who I think has disappeared from the scene now, said about him, he is so richly nuanced a character that it's impossible to describe him in political terms. I think that still is absolutely true. We all know, everybody who's had anything to do with him at all knows about his hill country background. So there's certainly no point in my talking about it. But I think the pertinent thing to ask, the first thing to ask about him in terms of his hill country background and his college experience at what is now Texas State University, but was then Southwest Texas State Teachers College. When he became president, and this question was asked then and has been asked many times since, was he in any way intimidated by the giants around him, most of whom he inherited from the Kennedy administration? McNamara, Bundy, Rusk. And I think that answer has never been answered fully. I think there are times, of course, that it's clear that he seemed to be intimidated. He referred to that experience often in a self-deprecatory manner, and the files here are replete with statements he made when he was meeting with groups of people and some of his cabinet was around. And he would talk about the fact that in this company there are 2 graduates of Harvard and 3 graduates of Yale and a product of Princeton, and one from a teacher's college in San Marcos, Texas. It always got a laugh, and it always pleased him. Johnson was, the twin themes run through any discussion of him. One was that he was complicated, and the other was that he was contradictory. And here a contradiction certainly appears. Even as he was describing himself that way, the people around him, the Bundys and the McNamaras, all described him as one of the most intelligent men they ever knew. Clearly it was a finely tuned intelligence that was nothing like McNamara's and nothing like Bundy's, but was it was unique and all his own. He was about his background. He was sensitive about it, sensitive to the point that some thought represented insecurity, and maybe it did. He said once that he had had enough of the derisions about his style, his family, to last a lifetime, and he was sick of it. And he said that as he was contemplating, he said he was contemplating leaving public life. Well, another part of the contradiction is that that would never have happened. He would never have let anything drive him out of public life like a feeling of insecurity. There is he was proud. The other part of the contradiction, he's very proud of his hill country experience, and he referred to it often in his speeches, public and private. Proud of it, but also careful about it. Bob Hardesty and I, as Mark said, worked with him on his memoirs. We had an outline of the chapters that we were going to write. And we would meet with President Johnson at the end of the day and discuss those chapters, or whichever chapter was up for grabs. And he would begin to reminisce. And he would do it in those wonderful, wonderful hill country terms. And we would be fascinated. And we would endeavor in our writing to get that into the chapters. But when he saw the chapter in draft form, he made us take all of that stuff out. He thought it did not sound presidential. So we watched helplessly as the essential Lyndon Johnson disappeared from those pages, and a very much more formal Lyndon Johnson appeared. And that's the vantage point. His memoir, I think, is a good book. I'm not sure how history regards it now, but I think it is faithful to the documentation. But what is lacking is the personality of the putative author. One story, however, did manage to slip by him, and it did get in. I'm not sure to this day whether it was deliberate that he left it in or accidental. We were talking about the chapter to be written on Medicare, and I had that chapter to do. And he told the story of how Wilbur Cohen, who was eventually to become Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, but was then the administration's point man on the Hill for Medicare, called the president from Capitol Hill one day and told him that the Medicare bill was in conference. It had gone through the House, it had gone through the Senate, and now a committee from each was meeting in conference to work out the differences between them. But Wilbur said in his call to the president, they're not trying to resolve differences. They're going to improve that bill. They're going to make a stronger bill than we sent from the White House. What should we do, Mr. President? And the president, as he told Wilbur, I'd run get my brother. And then he told us the reason for that particular phrase was he told the story of the man trying to get a job as a brakeman in one of the railroad stations in the Hill Country, was asked in his verbal test, what would he do if he was told that two trains were on a collision course and they were not very far apart? And the man said, I'd run get my brother because my brother's never seen a train wreck. I thought that was a good story, and I put it into the draft, and to my delight and surprise, it survived LBJ's reading, so it stayed in. Wilbur Cohen was a man who was involved in everything in that chapter, so I sent the whole chapter in draft to Cohen to look at and read for accuracy, and he called me back after he had read it, and he said, yeah, it's all there, it's okay, everything's accurate, except for one thing. It's that run get my brother story. He did tell me that story, but it was another occasion. He didn't tell me on this occasion. So I dutifully went back and told the president that. And the president said, "You go back and ask Wilbur whose book this is." So of all the stories that were lost to history, that one made it, and I'm glad it's there. One experience out of his hill country life that had made an enormous difference to President Johnson, had an enormous impact on him, was the year he spent teaching in Cotulla, Texas, a Mexican-American town down in the valley. He taught at a Mexican school, and that experience so affected him that it came out later in many, many ways, in many references. I'll refer to it again, but I just want to say that I think the most effective speech that President Johnson ever made during his presidency was the address to the Congress when he asked for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Not only do I think it was one of his great addresses, I think it was one of the great presidential speeches of all time, truly. I'd like to claim credit for it, but it was delivered before I got to the White House, so I cannot. Part of that speech is a reference to that Cotulla experience. I think that I learned early some secrets that made me attuned to Lyndon Johnson. And these were secrets, I think, that everyone who worked for him and stayed, who worked for him and survived, would learn. One was, don't take him seriously at times, at all times. Learn quickly when he's heaping on too much hype. I hadn't been on the White House staff too long when my wife and I were invited to a lunch that was being given for the Prime Minister of Barbados. And as we went through the line, the President took me by the elbow and introduced me to the Prime Minister as his most trusted advisor. Well, it certainly impressed my wife, and I think it impressed the Prime Minister, but it had a different kind of effect on me. The other thing that I learned was when to tell when he was blowing off steam. And he did that quite often. And I think probably the most dramatic illustration I know that affected me came in October of 1968. 1968 was a terrible year. Johnson himself called it the nightmare year. In March, he had taken himself out of the political race by announcing he was not going to run again for president. And in doing that, he thought he was taking the war out of the political season. And he was hailed as a selfless patriot across the nation. The protests, which had so bothered him, stopped for a good while. But things went wrong. Although the peace talks started in Paris, they were stalled. Even the South Koreans were, South Vietnamese, I'm sorry, my age is showing on me there, but our allies in South Vietnam were dragging their feet about getting to the conference table. The protests started up again, and President Johnson was to speak to a group of veterans in Detroit, and I wrote that speech. And I got word that he wanted me to go with him, and so I got on the plane. And the steward came back and told me the president wanted me to join him in his cabin, which I did. And I went in, and George Christian, his press secretary, was there. And the president was going through the speech. It was clear he was reading it for the first time, and it was clear that he didn't like it. And he looked up at me and he said, I don't want to say this. He said, I'm tired of pussyfooting around. Now, October 1968, the whole thrust of the administration in Vietnam was to try to reach some kind of compromise with the other side. And that was what the speech that I had written, that was the direction it was aimed toward. And the president said, you know, I think we're pussyfooting too much. I think we have to say, and he was talking about the protesters now, I think those people that are bad-mouthing our policy ought to stand up and be counted and go over there and take their places beside our boys in the trenches. That's what I want to say. Well, that was a real whammer. It didn't make any sense. Beginning with the fact that there were no trenches in Vietnam, that's the first thing. And the second thing was why should people who are bad-mouthing our policy go over there and fight? None of it made any sense. I knew that. I knew it dangerous. I went back to my seat. George Christian, who also had been around him and also knew LBJ pretty well, also realized that it was nonsense. We worked together, George and I did, to modify the speech a little bit, make some changes in it, and give it to the typist so there would be a new set of cards. And then we stood at the back of the hall while the president spoke in Detroit. A little bit apprehensive that he might not go precisely with what he found on the speech cards, but might take off on a tangent. But he didn't. He stayed with the speech just as he found it on the speech cards, to my great relief, although I expected him to do that. We got back on the plane, and again I got word that he wanted me to join him, and I went into his cabin, and this time General Westmoreland was with him. Westmoreland had been in charge of the American forces in Vietnam and been called back in, back to Washington to take over as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And he had been in Detroit to meet with this group of veterans too, and the president had invited him to come back to Washington with him. And the president was very affable. Had me order a drink, which I did. We talked. He said, Harry, that speech I gave, that isn't the way I told you I wanted to do it, was it? I said, no, it wasn't, Mr. President. He said, you mind telling me why? And I said, well, Mr. President, I thought that on reflection, you really would not want to put it just the way you put it to me. And the president said, turned to Westmoreland and said, General, did you hear that? Poor old General Westmoreland, not knowing what was happening, said, sir, the president told him exactly what he had told me he wanted to put in that speech. He wanted those people that are bad-mouthing our policy stand up and be counted and go over there and take their place beside our boys. General, what would you do if one of your officers decided you really didn't mean an order you had given? How would you handle that? And Westmoreland, a controversial man in many ways, but he's a hero in my eyes, if for no other reason than this. He said, well, Mr. President, I think we have to decide these things on a case-by-case basis. And in this case, I think Harry did us all a favor because, frankly, I don't know what I would have done with those sons of bitches. The president listened to that, and I watched him. I can't say there was a smile on his face, but there was a certain bemusement. And this is the point. It's a tough point to get across, but it is a point. He knew exactly what I was going to do with that speech. He knew he had never made so dumb a public statement in his life, and he wasn't about to do it this time. If he had not known me and known the way I was going to react, he never would have told me what he wanted to, the things he wanted to put in that speech. But he knew that I knew that he was blowing off steam, and he knew that that what I was going to do about preparing a new set of speech cards for him. That story is as close as I can come to illustrating how closely I think we were attuned. There is always the niggle in my mind. Suppose he had been serious, we never would have made it back to Washington. We would have been drummed out of town on a rail. But but I understood what he was doing, and he knew I did. Johnson was not a great communicator, and that's been said many times. He was not. He followed John Kennedy, who was a marvelous communicator, but Johnson was not. Television was not a friend to him. Lady Bird Johnson called him one of the last of the courthouse politicians, because a courthouse square was about the limit of number of people that he could speak to and speak well to. He was just great as a one-on-one communicator and with small groups. His ability to speak forcibly and persuasively and effectively one-on-one was also communicated to his use of the telephone. He was just about as good on the telephone as he was in person. Many of us have memories of those telephone conversations with him, and sometimes they run the gamut from funny to much more serious, and sometimes neither of the two. One that sticks in my mind, which I'll tell you about, which is, I think, one of the funniest I heard, I had from him. And I tell it realizing that I'm running the danger of portraying him as a comedian, and I don't really want to do that, but he could be pretty funny at times. After we were down here, while we were still working on his book, and we were stationed in the federal building. He called me one day and asked me, he was at the ranch, and he called me and asked me if I knew why Governor Preston Smith, who was the new governor in Texas, and Johnson had just met, if I knew why he was wanted to come out to see him. Well, I had no idea. And he said, well, I want to find out what he wants. I can't do it. There's no way I can find that out. Later in the day, I had occasion to call the president again on another matter, and I asked if the governor had come out. The president said, yes, he came. He brought his wife, and he brought his wife's mother. It was too late to offer him lunch, and it was too early to have a drink. They didn't want to ride around the ranch. I tried every way I could to find out what he wanted, and I never did. He said, if he wanted me to kiss his ass, I wish he'd told me that. I've been in that business for 40 years. As I said, I know, and everybody who had the experience of having a telephone conversation with President Johnson knows how effective he was as a communicator on the telephone. Now history knows, because this library has opened tapes of telephone conversations that he recorded secretly in the White House. The story of that is one of the great stories of this institution. When I tell it, I want to tell you that all of us who were here at the time share in this story. It's not mine alone by any means. It's Tina's and Regina's and Claudia's and Tissing's and everybody that was here at the time. After President Johnson died, a woman named Mildred Stegall, who at 105, I think, is still alive. She had worked for him in a confidential capacity since her congressional days. She came to me to tell me that she had in her care 8 record setter cartons that were filled with dictabells of tapes of conversations that President Johnson had recorded in the White House secretly. And he had left them in her care with instructions that if they were still in her care when he died, she should turn them over to me with conveying instructions from him that they should be kept closed for a period of 50 years. Well, this was one of the great contradictions. He had told me to open everything. Now, here was instructions to keep these documents closed for 50 years. It was a baffling, instruction, but I accepted them on that basis. And the first thing, Charles Corcoran was then the supervisory archivist, and he and Tina told me that the first thing that they had to do was to make sure that they were preserved. And when they opened the boxes, they found that these dictabelts were crammed together and in a way that would have been destructive if they had stayed that way. So they began the process of preserving them. And then the story gets complicated after that, but it's a rich story. The dictabelts that these had been recorded on were now outmoded, and there was no way to play them on machines that then existed. So a machine had to be I think recreated somehow or other, so that these things could be preserved. But at any rate, for almost 20 years, the tapes existed here in their new containers, preserved but still under wraps. We all began to think that this 50-year restriction should not apply. It didn't make any sense. When we were opening everything else, why hold these back? I had no idea, nobody did, what was in them. We were all sure that they were going to be historically important. So finally, I consulted legal counsel at National Archives, legal counsel here in Austin, found out from them that legally there was nothing to keep me from breaking that ban. The instructions from President Johnson were verbal and were not conveyed to me directly. So at any rate, I had occasion to talk to Mrs. Johnson about it. She had no idea they existed. She said, well, I'll support you, whatever you decide to do. She's a very gutsy lady. She really was. Wonderful, wonderful, courageous lady. And so we decided we're going to open them. Now they're all open. They, as I said, they know now. Because of them, history knows how effective a communicator he was. I played some of these tapes the other day to the CIA people, but I'm not going to do that, all of them today. I think that's going to take up too much time, but I urge you, whenever you get a chance, to listen particularly to these. These are some that I am particularly fond of. There are two conversations with Senator Everett Dirksen, who was minority leader of the Senate, and they're back to back. Dirksen wanted something from President Johnson. Johnson wanted some Republican votes that he could get from Dirksen. It is a marvelous illustration of wheeler-dealership in action. That's the way business was conducted in the 1960s, and it was conducted very successfully. It is a good set of tapes. There are others. There's a conversation with Senator Ribicoff of Connecticut, a Democrat, who was dragging his feet on a vote that Johnson wanted. And Johnson, in this conversation, reminds him of past favors Johnson conveyed on him when they were both in the Senate and Johnson was majority leader. Another conversation with another Democrat that Johnson wanted a vote from, holding out the promise of future benefits. These are all illustrations of the Johnson treatment. There is one other illustration in a tape that we are going to play. This is a very short one, but it's one that I don't know quite how to describe, but it is part of the Johnson treatment that he could use when he wanted. Catherine Graham was publisher of the Washington Post, and Johnson wanted something from her, and this is the way that conversation started. Charles, can we just do the Kay Graham tape? Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. President.
Hello, my sweetheart. How are you?
Well, I'm fine. Are you?
You know, the only one thing I dislike about this job is that I'm married, and I can't ever get to see you. I just hear that sweet voice, and it's always on telephone. And I'd like to break out of here and be like one of these young animals down on my ranch, jump a fence.
Johnson could be crude. Almost anything you read about him will talk about his crudity. Some of the most outrageous examples of that I never experienced. I'll just have to say I didn't. I was not. I didn't see it. The other side of him was what I would say was damn near poetic, and that's the part that I, in my mind, treasure. Wilbur Cohen, whom I referred to before, recognized this in him, and he said once that Johnson was a mixture of Keats and Shelley and Boccaccio. The poetry the near poetry that I remember so well was not Keats or Shelley, but it was hill country. He spoke in that vernacular that was so compelling. The last time that I saw President Johnson was a week before his death. It was at his ranch on a Saturday evening. He had just come back from New Orleans, where he'd attended a memorial service for an old congressional colleague named Hale Boggs. And the entire political establishment was there. And something about it rubbed against LBJ's sense of values. And to Lady Bird, with some of us listening in, he talked about his own death. And he said, when I die, I don't want just our friends who can come in their planes. I want the men who drive their trucks to be welcome, too, and the women whose skirts hang down below their dresses. Well, that image, to me, just is very compelling. I presume by skirts he meant their underskirts, and the picture is very clear in my mind of those hill country women that he was talking about. Once I was riding around the ranch with him. I rode around the ranch with him on a number of occasions, but on this occasion, he talked a great deal about a number of things, and often when this would happen, I would always have my notebook, my secretary's notebook with me, and when I thought it was appropriate, I would take down what he was saying. When I sensed that he didn't really want me to do it, I didn't. On this occasion, he did. He did indicate that he didn't care. So I started writing. I wrote so long that by the time I got back to Austin and started transcribing it all, my hand was really hurting. And a good part of what he said was a reflection on how he felt about the students who were out on the streets protesting him. Again, I'm not going to repeat that now. It's here in the library. I felt so strongly about it that when we were redoing the exhibit, the major exhibit, I had these words emblazoned on the wall in the museum area. And it starts with, my heart was with the students, although they would never know that and probably would never believe it. And if you ever are down there on the third floor and you have an occasion to go around to look at that Vietnam exhibit, I urge you to take a look at those words, because they are as much as anything else Lyndon Johnson. Just as I said, there are twin themes that run through a discussion of LBJ, his contradictedness and his complication. There are twin themes, of course, that run through his presidency, and we're everybody in this room is aware of what they are. One is the great social revolution that he launched through the Great Society, with all those programs, the 3 civil rights bills, the education reform bills, and the Medicare for the aged, arts and humanities bills, the protection for the consumer in the marketplace, the first efforts to protect the environment. As Lady Bird said, we trotted it out on the stage, and they did. And then through it all, the overarching war on poverty. That is, of course, the part, the theme that we all would like to concentrate on. But there is another theme that runs through it, and that's Vietnam. There's a new biographer of Lyndon Johnson. His name is Charles Peters. It's a thin volume. He doesn't bring anything really new to the discussion of Johnson, but he does have some, I think, some very pertinent observations to make. And one of them is, he writes, "It seems likely that history will rank Lyndon Johnson in the group of presidents just below the tier of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt." He goes on to say that despite Johnson's great domestic achievements, Vietnam will forever prevent him from being considered for that top tier of presidents. And that does seem to be the judgment of historians now. It has been estimated, and I believe it, that 90% of the scholarly work on Vietnam now concludes that Vietnam was a mistake. History is not static, and it's possible that someday those statistics will change. But that's the way it stands right now. And it cannot be ignored. Johnson inherited that war, as we all know, beginning with the Truman administration. The American establishment wanted to keep the communists from controlling Vietnam. By the time Johnson took over, inherited the war, there were already 16,000 American troops in Vietnam as advisors. They were advising the Vietnamese. Johnson was as much a Cold Warrior as the presidents who preceded him were. And he responsibly accepted his responsibility for that war. But we know now, as we did not then, how agonized he was over his inheritance. In the early part of 1964, he talked to his National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, and right after that to his mentor, Senator Richard Russell, about his feelings. Let's just play one of them. Let's play, we're getting running out of time, I'm sure. Let's play the Bundy tape.
I'll tell you, the more I just stayed awake last night thinking about this thing, the more I think of it, I don't know what in the hell, it looks like me we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I believe the Chinese communists coming into it, I don't think that we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home and ever get anywhere in that area. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. And it's just the biggest damn mess.
It is. It's an awful mess.
And we just got to think about, I look at this sergeant of mine this morning, got 6 little old kids over there, and he's getting out my things and bringing me in my night reading and all that kind of stuff. And I just thought about ordering those kids in there, and what in the hell am I ordering him out there for?
One thing that is
Vietnam worth to me? What is Laos worth to me? What is it worth to this country?
No, we have to.
Now we got a treaty, but still, we got a treaty, but hell, everybody else got a treaty out there, and they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you start running the communists, they may just chase you right into your own kitchen.
Yeah, that's the trouble. And that is what.
And shortly after that, he spoke to Senator Richard Russell in Georgia, who had been, as I said, his old mentor in the Senate, and the conversation was pretty much the same. You got a sense from that of just how agonized he was over this war. But little more than a year later, the same president who was so agonized, in effect Americanized the war. Americanized it in a way that it could never, there could be hardly any change from after that. The war had not gone well from the time he took over, and it had its ups and downs, and the story of it is well documented in these files here. But it got to the place where in July 1965, General Westmoreland told him that the war was going to be lost unless there would be a change in American policy. And the change he wanted was a massive infusion of American troops over there. I think the number was, well, whatever it was, a great deployment of American troops and a change in the mission of American troops. Up to this point, the mission of these troops over there had been advisors. They were there to advise the South Vietnamese military how to conduct their army. Westmoreland wanted to employ them as combat troops. Johnson, I'm using the word agonized again, but it certainly was the word to use. He did that for a long time, a couple of weeks, and eventually announced that he was giving Westmoreland what he wanted, what Westmoreland asked for. Charles Peters, the new biographer that I referred to a minute ago, writes this: the New York Times account of the July 28th press conference, which was the one in which Johnson announced he was giving Westmoreland what he wanted, ran under the headline, "President's Wife is Near Tears." It was not hard to believe that Lady Bird would be near tears, because no one understood better than she that her husband knew that each step he was taking could lead to a tragic end. She had begun to notice troubling symptoms in the president and asked two friends who were physicians to examine him. They reported that he was laboring under a heavy load of tension and a fog of depression. Bill Moyers, I'm still quoting Peters, described Johnson as tormented, and he foresaw that the record of his presidency would be ruined by Vietnam. And Johnson himself wrote about being sleepless at night and about his lonely vigils. So why then, knowing all that, seeing all that, believing all that, why did he take this fateful step of Americanizing the war? Over the years, there have been a number of theories advanced. One was that he thought he could get by with it, that somehow by doing it slowly, the country would never know precisely what he was doing. Another is that he was imbued with the Texas macho spirit, and he did not want to appear cowardly. And then always there was the contention that somehow the fear of the Kennedys was going to destroy him if he didn't. I can't comment on any of them. I don't know. They're all speculations, and my own answer is also speculative. But I'll tell you what I think on the basis of part of what I knew, and when I say I knew, it's because of what I heard the president say. He heard voices of caution at that time. Undersecretary of State George Ball said, "I don't think we can win if we do this." Clark Clifford, an old friend who would eventually become Secretary of Defense, said, "I see nothing but catastrophe ahead for our country if we do this." Senator Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, said, "I'm afraid we're leading the country deeper into a war that the country will eventually not support." And these voices of caution weighed very, very heavily on him. But they were trumped by voices urging action. The military said, take this action that General Westmoreland wants, and it will turn the tide of the war. And of all the voices urging action, the most persuasive, was that of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who warned of the consequences of not taking this action. What Rusk wrote to the President was, "The integrity of the United States commitment is the principal pillar of peace throughout the world. If that commitment becomes unreliable, the communist world would draw conclusions that would lead to our ruin and almost certainly to a catastrophic war." Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, in his book, says that view, Rusk's view, that if we lost Vietnam, we would increase the risk of World War III, influenced all of us to varying degrees. He wrote, "I cannot overstate the impact our generation's experience had on all of us, an experience that began historically with the appeasement at Munich." So there it was, the lesson of Munich. That was the lesson that guided the entire American political establishment from the end of World War II right through the end of the Cold War, in every step that was taken. The lesson of Munich. Johnson referred to that lesson in his own terms, and you heard a little bit of it earlier when in the conversation with his National Security Advisor. But the way he put it was, if you let a bully come and chase you out of your front yard, the next day he'll be on your porch. And the day after that, he'll be raping your wife in your own bed. But the impact of that lesson, minus the color, was forceful. And discussing the fateful decision that, in effect, Americanized the war, as we worked with him on his memoirs, he said starkly, "I was staring at World War III." Now, in the years that followed, many of the actors who had been on the scene have changed their minds about Vietnam, had second thoughts. McNamara, Clifford, Bundy. I did too. I wrote speeches about Vietnam for President Johnson in the White House, speeches that endeavored to explain why we're there and what the stakes were, and I believed it all. And only in the years that followed, years when I was here in this library, when the dominoes did not fall, the juggernaut did not sweep across the Pacific, the lesson of Munich did not apply, did that belief begin to erode. The question arises, did Johnson have second thoughts? Did he ever have second thoughts? Everything I know about him convinces me that when he made that July 1965 decision to send combat troops over to Vietnam, he made that decision believing that to do otherwise would run the risk of the catastrophic war that Secretary Rusk had predicted. I'm convinced of that. But what about later? Did he ever have second thoughts? And everything I know about him would persuade me that he did not, except for one thing, one document. And that is this document that is here in this library. It is a document that was sent to him by the director of CIA in October of 1968. It was sent with a covering sheet by the director of the CIA, Dick Helms, who wrote, "The attached paper is sensitive, particularly if its existence were to leak. It comes to you in a sealed envelope." This is what he wrote to the president. "Since part of my job is to examine contingencies, and since our involvement in Vietnam has many facets, I recently asked one of my most experienced intelligence analysts in the Office of National Estimates to attempt to set forth what the United States' stake is in that struggle. In other words, what would happen? What would be the case if the communists took over Vietnam?" And the document itself talks about occupies a little bit more than 30 pages, all secret, concludes that not very much would happen. There would be some damage to American prestige, but it wouldn't be lasting. There would be some internal dissension inside this country, but it wouldn't be lasting, and it would not be terribly important. Well, what about the dominoes? Would they fall? And what about United States security? And the document states, we do not conclude that other states in Asia would inevitably fall under communist control in the wake of communist success in Vietnam. But if one or more states in Southeast Asia did, in fact, fall under communist control, this would mean a major frustration of United States policy aims, but we think would not bring any major threat to United States security. This document came to the President in October of 1968. There is no indication that anyone else ever saw it. It was declassified here in about 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, John. Bob McNamara was here doing research on his book. He saw it for the first time when he was doing research. He said in his book that he had never seen it before. Nobody else had. John Wilson tells me that there was a flurry of activity about it when it was opened, the document, but I've never seen any reference to it in any of the books about President Johnson that I have, that I'm familiar with. It's almost as if it didn't exist. What influence did it have on President Johnson? Did it in any way influence his decision that he announced in March 1968 not to run again? Did he believe it? Did it haunt him in any way? As I said, I went through the whole experience of walking through the war with him in doing his memoir. Never heard a reference to it. Nobody did. It is, to my mind, the one outstanding, unresolved, unknown, unknowable question about Lyndon Johnson. And that's it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Well, did anyone have any questions of Harry?
How many writers worked on the Vantage Point? I know you, Bob Hardesty,
I'm sorry?
How many writers worked on the Vantage Point?
Well, Bob and I were the ones that came down with him to work on the Vantage Point. Later, he called Doris Kearns, who was a graduate student at Harvard, to come help on some of it. Walt Rostow was here for other matters, but he came to work for the university, but he helped on some of the foreign policy stuff. And Bill Jordan came from the State Department on a temporary assignment to help on some of it. So there were 5 of them that were involved. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were drafts of the Vantage Point using the Hill Country vernacular that the president rejected. Were those destroyed, or do they still exist?
Tina?
They're down in the vault.
Oh, right.
It's all White House years materials.
Anyone else? Well, I think we all have great pride in where we work, and one of the reasons I'm very proud to work here is because of the resources that we have available to us and to the public. And to my mind, there's no greater resource that we have than the folks in this room. And there's, in particular, there's no greater resource than the man to my left. I want to thank Harry again for coming today. And I want to thank you all for spending additional times away from your desks to hear Harry. I think it's really important. And I know that you will all gotten a better understanding of Lyndon Johnson today, and I hope a better understanding of Harry Middleton as well. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And you're under a great leader here now, too, so you've got a good ride ahead of you. I congratulate you.